Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
I am going to start with the part everyone keeps replaying in their heads whenever I tell this story, because if I ease into it the way my therapist wishes I would, with context and patience and some careful backstory about family roles and old expectations, you will think I am dressing it up to make myself look better. So here it is, straight and plain and exactly as it happened. My dad lifted his glass at the end of my birthday dinner and, with that cheerful tone he uses when he wants to disguise something mean as a joke we are all supposed to take lightly, said that I had been living off them for too long and that it was time to go, and he laughed first, a short laugh that told everyone else it was safe to chuckle, and they did, some louder than others. And I felt my face do that small, tight thing it does when I am trying not to give anyone the satisfaction, while my mom stared at the bread plate and my brother smirked into his phone like he had been waiting to screen record my reaction for weeks. I did not make a scene because I have learned that scenes let other people call you dramatic and stop listening to what you are actually saying, so I swallowed all the words that came rushing up and picked only the ones that would land without crying attached to them. And I said that if this was a family decision, it would have been nice to hear it in a family conversation and not as a punchline, especially not on a day that is supposed to be about kindness and a little forgiveness for old mistakes. And he said it was tough love, and my mom murmured that I should not take it personally, which is the sentence she uses for everything that cuts deep, and my brother, who has never paid a full month of anything on time, told me that independence would be good for me, and I looked at him for one long second that I hoped would say more than I was willing to say out loud, and then I took a breath and said, fine, if that is how we are playing it, fine. You know that feeling when a joke shoves you into a corner, and you have to decide whether you will claw your way out or pretend the corner is where you wanted to be all along, because that is where I found myself. Remembering the year I moved home to help when my dad's work fell off and the savings thinned to the point where bills turned into a weekly negotiation. Remembering the quiet errands I ran to the bank and the conversations I had with people who speak in firm voices about due dates and grace periods. Remembering the little systems I set up so the pressure would not crush them, and most of all remembering how none of it fit the story my family prefers to tell about me, the airy youngest who never quite launches, the helper who can be taken for granted because she always softens and forgives, the one you can joke about because she never fights back hard. So I smiled and asked if we were done because the server was hovering with a cake I no longer wanted, and I was suddenly very tired of making room for everyone else's comfort, and my dad, buoyed by the laughter and the glow of his own courage, said yes. We are done, and I thought, not yet, we are not, and I reached into my bag and took out the card I keep for emergencies, not because I planned to be generous, but because I wanted control of the next 5 minutes, and I waved the server over and said we would settle the check now, and my dad started to protest out of habit, since paying for things is one of the few ways he knows to perform fatherhood when words fail him. And I placed the card on the tray before he could reach for his wallet and told the server to run it, but to split the bill so that my portion was separate and for the table portion to be charged to this card only for tonight and then never again, because the automatic arrangement attached to the other account was being discontinued. And it was a stupidly careful sentence that probably sounded like corporate email to everyone else, but it landed where I needed it to land, because I watched my dad's face go blank at the phrase, the other account, and my mom shift in her seat like a detail she had chosen not to keep in focus just sharpened on its own. I did not explain, not yet, because explanations are gifts, and I was done with free gifts for people who called me a sponge in front of strangers. So I kept my tone even and thanked everyone for coming and told my brother to send me the few photos where I did not look like I wanted to bite someone, and when he said I was overreacting I said he was underthinking, which made him roll his eyes in that lazy way that always gets him what he wants from my parents, because it makes him look like a harmless teenager even though he is old enough to know better, and then I signed for my portion and for the table, added the kind of tip I leave when I am determined not to let my family's behavior splash on the staff, and told the server I appreciated their patience with us, which I meant, because they looked like they wished they were anywhere else. On the ride home, my mom asked if we could not talk about money in the car because it made her anxious, and I said I was not talking about money, I was talking about respect, and my dad started to say that those are the same thing when someone is living in your house. And I said I understood, which was true. I do understand the way he was raised to equate authority with who holds the mortgage. I just happen to disagree that authority gives you the right to humiliate, and he muttered that I always find a way to make him the villain, and I said that if he does not want the part, he does not have to audition for it, and then I looked out the window and counted my breaths until we pulled into the driveway. Because I knew if I kept going I would say the other things I was saving for later. Inside, I packed a small bag with the things I knew I would want in the morning, not because I was running away, but because I do my best thinking when I remove myself from the noise, and I slept on the couch even though my room was upstairs. And if that sounds symbolic, then fine, it was, because I needed the reminder that everything can be rearranged, including me, and when I woke up before dawn I made coffee and drafted a list of the tasks I would do before I left so there would be no loose ends they could use to drag me back into their cycle, and at the bottom of the list I wrote one line in plain words that were for me only: close the tap, and I underlined it once, because there are habits you can only end if you call them by their true name. When they finally came downstairs, my dad with that stiff neck he gets after a night of righteous anger, my mom with her please just say sorry face, and my brother already typing something in a group chat I can picture without seeing. I told them I would be out by dinner and that I would leave a copy of the keys on the kitchen counter, and when my dad said he hoped this would be a wake-up call for me, I looked him in the eye and said it was, and that I had already made the first adjustment. Then I picked up my phone, called the bank, confirmed the instruction I had placed earlier from the bathroom at the restaurant while the singing and clapping drowned out any chance of being overheard, and asked them to finalize the closure of the automatic payment account that has, for a long time, quietly handled a bill my parents think comes from a place that does not involve me. And when the representative thanked me and said the change would be effective the next business day, I said perfect, and I hung up and I looked at my dad, who had no idea what I had just done or what those words would mean by morning, and I said, since you are so eager for me to stand on my own, I figured you would want the same for yourselves. He opened his mouth to demand details, and I smiled in a way that told him he would get none tonight, because I wanted him to sit with the echo of that one line the same way I have sat with his, and that was my first move. Not loud, not cruel, just precise and overdue, which is why I picked up my bag and walked past him without waiting for his speech, leaving him standing there with a question he would not know how to ask and an answer that would land tomorrow like a hammer, because they had no idea what was coming next. By morning I had done the small things that keep me from spiraling, not because routines solve everything but because they keep my hands busy while my head clears, so I folded my clothes into a single suitcase in a way that made sense to me, stacked the few books I wanted in a grocery bag, because judgment can wait and paper cannot, wiped down the bathroom like a tenant who expects her deposit back even though there was never a lease for me, and then I sat on the edge of the couch where I had slept and waited for the house to wake up, telling myself that I would not be the one to start the conversation, and that if they wanted a grown decision, they could make a grown entrance instead of another performance dressed as advice. My dad came in first with that clatter he does when he wants to be heard before he is seen, full of busy energy and the kind of certainty that grows overnight when someone talks to the mirror and convinces himself he is the brave one in the story. And he looked around at the suitcase, the neat stack of folded towels, the bare coffee table, and he said that he was glad I was taking this seriously because sometimes a little push is what a person needs, and I nodded in a way that let him finish the script in his head while I saved my breath for the line that mattered, and when he asked if I had a plan I said I always do, which he ignored, because the narrative he likes does not include me having plans that work without his permission. He tried to outline his conditions like a landlord who just discovered the power of bullet points, saying I had until the end of the week, saying I should leave my key on the hook, saying he would box up anything I forgot and, if necessary, donate it, saying that this would be good for me because learning to stand on your own 2 feet builds character, and I listened because I wanted him to step fully into the role he had assigned himself, and when he paused to check whether I would interrupt or argue or cry, I just asked if he was done, and when he said yes, I told him I would be out by dinner, that there would be no boxes to deal with, that my key would be on the counter, and that I had already taken care of the one thing he has never once asked about because asking would require admitting I was not a burden but a backbone, and then I watched that familiar flicker cross his face, the one where curiosity and fear shake hands. He said what thing, because he cannot stand not knowing, and I said the account, and I let the word sit there for a second because it deserved to be heard by itself after years of running quietly in the background, and then I added, in the same even voice I use at work when I am denying an unreasonable request, that I had closed the account that pays your mortgage, and I said it like a fact you cannot bargain with, like gravity, like the date on a bill, and the silence that followed was not dramatic in the movie way, it was practical, like when a machine stops and you suddenly hear how loud it had been all along, and his mouth tightened, and he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said exactly what it sounds like, and he said, "You do not pay our mortgage." And I said that is interesting because the bank's software thinks otherwise, and my mom, who had been hovering in the hallway pretending to water a plant that does not need daily attention, stepped into the room with that careful voice that says she is trying to keep the house from catching fire, and she asked me if this was a joke, and I told her I was done with jokes. I did not give them a PowerPoint because no one earns that from me anymore, but I did say this, that years ago, when things got tight and the lender was sending letters with tones that made my mom's hands shake, I set up a dedicated account in my name only that handled one thing and one thing only, the monthly payment on this house, and I funded it from the rental income on a place they never wanted to hear about because it did not fit their version of me. And that as of this morning that account was closed, not paused, not reduced, not renegotiated, closed, which means there is no more silent cushion between them and the consequences of treating me like an overgrown dependent in a chair I paid for. And my dad said you cannot just do that. And I said I already did, and he said we will fix it, and I said good luck, truly, because I meant it. I am not trying to ruin you, I am just done saving you while you call me dead weight. He demanded details like dates and amounts and who authorized what and whether the lender would really stop pulling funds that do not exist anymore. And I told him he could call the bank and ask the questions he should have asked years ago when money politely appeared on schedule as if by magic. And when he said this is vindictive, I said this is proportional. Because a person who laughs at their daughter while calling her a leech in front of guests deserves to feel what it is like when the person you depend on stops cushioning you from your own behavior, and my brother chose that moment to wander in with the swagger of someone who has never had a payment declined in public. And he said this is insane and selfish, and that I was punishing everyone for a joke, and I told him to sit this one out since the last time he applied for a card he used me as a reference and spelled my email wrong, which is how I learned about the application in the first place. Here is where I did the part that made it not just a boundary but a move, because I am tired of lines that get erased when someone cries or promises to be better. So I reached into the pocket of my tote and pulled out the slim folder I had prepared after the dinner when sleep would not come, and I slid it across the coffee table toward my dad and told him it contained the final statement from the closed account, the confirmation letter with the effective date, and the note to the lender, directing all future correspondence to the primary borrowers at the home address on file, which means their phones will ring and their mail will land and their digital reminders will ping, not mine. And I said that I had removed my email and phone number from every alert and contact field because it is time for them to be notified directly about the things they like to believe happen on their own. He said, "You think you are teaching us a lesson?" And I said, "No, I am teaching myself one, which is that love without respect turns into a tab that never gets paid until someone refuses to keep the lights on." And I stood up and zipped my suitcase and told my mom I would check in next week if she wanted that, but that I would not engage with any relative who came at me with blame dressed up as concern. And my phone buzzed right then with a message from an aunt asking if I had really stormed out of my own party, which told me the spin machine had already started, and I held the screen up and said this is exactly what I am talking about, and my dad told me to calm down and be reasonable. And I said I am calmer than you think and more reasonable than you have ever given me credit for. Then, because I believe in clean endings even when the feelings are messy, I walked to the kitchen, placed my house key on the counter next to a simple note that said I will send my forwarding address for any stray mail. And I added one more sentence that would either be read as a kindness or a threat depending on who held it, which said you should call the bank today. And when my dad barked my name in that old commanding way he uses when he wants me to freeze like I am still a teenager waiting for permission, I turned back and said, very calmly, that he should also call the insurance company to confirm the payment source on the homeowner's policy because I had handled that too and, just like the mortgage, I had stopped handling it. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect, and then I picked up my suitcase and opened the front door, and I left him with his mouth open and a folder in his hands, and a very long day ahead, because I had a ride waiting and a different plan for the afternoon, and by the time he reached anyone at the bank, the account would already be closed and the next draft would already be declined, which is why I smiled when my phone started ringing with his name and let it go to voicemail, saving his first real question for later, when I would decide whether or not to answer. I did not answer my dad's first calls because I knew the early ones would be full of anger and slogans and the kind of words people use when their certainty collapses and they need noise to fill the space. So I let them stack up while I sat in my friend Lena's kitchen with a cup that went cold and told her the version of my history my family has never wanted to hear, not because it is complicated, but because it ruins the parts they enjoy. And I started with the year when the overtime stopped. And the late notices began arriving with that stern voice banks used to make you feel like a child, and how my mom cried on the porch so my dad would not see, and how I called a lender instead of a cousin because pity does not reduce interest, and I asked for options. And a woman with the kind of competence that makes you want to send her a thank you card said there was a way to keep everything standing if payments became predictable and the debt picture looked better on paper, which is how I learned that ownership and control are cousins who do not always attend the same reunions. I had some savings from a job no one took seriously because it did not sound impressive at holidays, and I had one steady freelance client who paid on time because I made their life easier. And I also had the small 2-unit property I bought a few years earlier when a friend moved overseas and wanted out fast, which I managed quietly because the fewer opinions I heard, the more decisions I could make without defending them. And when I added those pieces together, the math was not pretty, but it was workable if the mortgage on my parents' house could be refinanced in a way that did not rely on my dad's variable income. So I set up a dedicated account under my name with a single purpose and an automatic pipeline from the rental income and my retainer. And for a while it was like building a canal around a problem river. Not glamorous, not exciting, but steady and dry. Which is what a home needs. Before anyone asks why they did not know, I will say this once in a way that feels fair even if it is sharp. They did not know because they did not ask. Because when I started talking about balances and due dates and restructuring, my dad's eyes glazed over and he said he would handle it, and my mom changed the subject to something she could control, like who was bringing pies to Thanksgiving, and my brother made jokes about me being the accountant of the family while asking if I could spot him for a few days until his check cleared, and I realized that if I wanted a solution I would have to build it without applause. So I kept receipts and email confirmations and recorded every phone call with a timestamp in a folder on my laptop labeled with a boring name that no one would ever click, and every month the lender pulled funds from the quiet account, the lights stayed on. The temperatures stayed comfortable, and my dad got to feel like the captain of a ship I was secretly keeping afloat, with a pump in the lower deck. At first I told myself I would say something when things calmed down, but then the habit formed and gratitude did not, and once it became clear that my contribution was invisible by design, I started to think of the arrangement less like a gift and more like a lease I had signed with myself, a private agreement to prioritize stability over recognition, and I kept it going even when it hurt a little. Like the month a tenant moved out without warning, and I covered the shortfall with my own emergency cushion, or the time a repair ate half of what I had planned to use for my student loan, because keeping them secure felt like the adult thing to do, and because I still believed that if I showed up enough times they would eventually see me clearly. The first crack in my patience did not come from money, it came from the way my dad started talking about me in front of extended family. telling this cute story about how I had always been a late bloomer and how some kids take longer to launch and how it is a good thing they have a big heart and a big house. And while he basked in the glow of his own generosity, I was on my phone transferring funds to make sure the next draft cleared before a holiday weekend delay. And I remember thinking this is what it looks like when someone borrows your effort to decorate their narrative, and I decided right then that I would not carry it forever. I would carry it until it served its purpose, and then I would set it down carefully and walk away. When my tenants gave notice this spring, I saw the opening I had been waiting for, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I wanted a moment to reset the table without breaking all the plates, and I did not relist immediately. I let the place sit. I took inventory of what I had been covering that no one acknowledged, not just the mortgage, but also the small annual policy that makes a disaster less disastrous, and the subscription my mom swears is included with something else, but never is, and I ran the numbers on what my life would look like if I redirected those funds back into me, and for the first time in years my own future did not feel like a side project. I know people will wonder whether my mom knew, and the honest answer is that she knew in the way a person knows the house stays comfortable without knowing the thermostat settings, which is to say she sensed my involvement but avoided the specifics, because specifics come with responsibilities she is not built for, and I do not say that with contempt. I say it with the clarity you earn when you stop trying to turn your parents into people they have never been. So when she asked at the table whether I was joking, what she really meant was, please do not make me learn this system now, and for once I did not protect her from that learning. Around midday, after I had told Lena the long version and eaten half a sandwich I could not taste, my phone buzzed again and again until I finally answered, because I wanted to hear which version of my dad I was going to get. And what came through the line was not the booming head of household voice, but a quieter one asking if we could talk like adults, and if I could come back, so we could figure out what this means. And I said we are already talking like adults, and this means exactly what it sounds like, and he said there must be a misunderstanding because he does not remember authorizing any of this, and I said that is correct. You do not remember authorizing any of this, because you did not, I did. And he went silent for a long beat that told me he was finally chewing on the part he has never wanted to swallow, which is that control has never really lived where he thinks it lives. He asked why I would do something so drastic without warning, and I said I did it with warning, the kind you gave me when you told me I had been living off you for too long and it was time to go, and he said that was different, and I said I agree, it was worse. And then I told him one final piece that I had not shared with anyone yet, which is that the 2-unit is sitting empty by choice, that I am not rushing to fill it, that I am prepared to sell it if that is what gets me a clean break, and that if he thinks I am bluffing, he should remember that I made an entire house payment system appear and disappear without him noticing, so my follow-through is not the issue. He asked to meet, said he wanted to see the papers, and I told him I would bring copies and that we could sit down tomorrow with the folder and a list of what is changing and what is not, but that there would be no begging and no bargaining and no raised voices, and that if he could agree to that I would come, and he said fine in a tone that meant not fine at all, and after we hung up I pulled the folder from my bag and added 2 items I had been hesitating about, the note from the title company confirming the structure we used years ago and the unsigned draft of a notice to the lender that I had prepared in case I ever needed to formalize a transfer of responsibility, and I slid them into the front pocket where he would see them first. Because tomorrow I was going to hand him the truth he keeps dodging, and I wanted him to recognize it by its letterhead, which is why, before I went asleep on Lena's pullout and turned off a lamp that has been kinder to me than my family this week, I wrote one last line on a sticky note and stuck it inside the folder, a reminder to myself not to soften the edges when he starts to pretend that none of this is fair, and the line said simply bring the deed page. Because if he wants to talk about ownership, he should see where my name lies, and when he looks up at me across the table tomorrow, I want him to understand that the balance of power changed a long time ago, and that I am done pretending it did not. By the time I walked back into the house for the meeting my dad demanded and pretended to phrase as a polite sit down, the story had already started traveling through the family like a forwarded chain message that picks up dust and drama with every hop. because my phone was a mess of missed calls and cousin paragraphs about how I should not let pride ruin a good thing and how parents only want what is best and how, if I needed a short-term loan to get my own place, I should just ask nicely. Instead of making a spectacle, which was almost funny considering the only public spectacle here was the one my dad staged at my birthday, and I could feel that old tremor in my chest that says defend yourself right now or the lie wins by default. But I ignored it because I had lived enough years to learn that the only way to beat a narrative is to make it run into facts it cannot bend. So I put my folder on the table, took a breath, and told myself I would not leave without saying all of it. Even the parts that would make my mom flinch and my brother retreat into a shrug. My dad came in with the rigid politeness he wears when he thinks he is about to be reasonable on camera, if life had cameras, and he started with a lecture about respect and timing and how family is supposed to handle disagreements privately, which would have landed differently if he had not chosen a birthday toast to announce my eviction, and I said I agreed that privacy matters, which is why I had kept my help private for years and why I would keep this conversation focused and practical, and then I slid the top sheet across to him, the confirmation of account closure with the date written out in full words so there would be no quibbling about when the next draft would fail, and my mom asked, in that tiny voice she uses when she hopes to test how much room she has to negotiate, whether I could at least keep the account open for one more month while they figured out a plan, and I said no, because one more month turns into one more season, and then one more year. And I have already given enough seasons of my life to other people's comfort. What I did not expect that morning, or maybe what I did not want to admit I expected, was the smear campaign already humming along like a generator in the backyard, because while we were talking my brother's phone lit up. And he glanced down with that smirk he cannot help when he thinks he has a secret ally, and then he made the mistake people who lie often make, which is thinking they can multitask their manipulation. So when he stupidly screenshot the family group chat where he and two aunts and a cousin were strategizing about how to corner me into resuming the payments by threatening to go to our church group with a story about me taking money from my parents and abandoning them, he meant to forward it to one person and instead sent it to me, which arrived on my screen mid-sentence with my full name spelled correctly for once, accompanied by a note that said something like remember to bring up the time she stayed here rent-free, and I looked up slowly and asked him if he wanted to explain or if he wanted me to read it aloud. He tried to laugh it off and said it was just venting, and I said venting does not come with bullet points and timestamps, and then I did the thing I had promised myself I would do if this got dirty, not to humiliate but to disinfect, which was to airdrop the screenshot to my parents so the plan could not slither back into the shadows, and I followed it by opening my folder and laying out a short, sober stack of proofs, not a performance, just documents, the refinance letters from years ago, the automatic payment confirmations with the account tail numbers, the email threads where I negotiated a late fee waiver during the year my dad got sick and could not work, the receipts for the homeowner's policy I had covered by default because letting that lapse would have been reckless, all of it lined up in a way that looked boring and undeniable, which is exactly how truth should look when it is time to stop arguing. My mom started crying not because of the facts, but because of what the facts do to her favorite picture of us, and she asked why I had not told her, and I said I had, in the only language anyone here understands, which is action. And that at any point anyone could have asked me how the bills were getting paid, and I would have answered, and my dad said this is all very convenient, and I said convenience is exactly what I took away when I closed the account, and that if he wanted to talk about inconvenience, we could list the years I ate my frustration so the house would be quiet, and then I said the one thing I had been holding back because I wanted to see whether they would push me to say it, which is that I was done being their invisible infrastructure, and that while I would not expose them publicly, I would also not let them weaponize a lie against me in private without response. So here is the part that will either make people cheer or clutch their pearls, and either reaction is fine with me. I opened my email draft address list, selected the handful of relatives who had already messaged me with lectures based on falsehoods, and I sent one calm message with no adjectives and no flourish that attached 3 documents and said, in plain words, that I had quietly supported the mortgage and the property insurance for years, that I had discontinued those payments after Being publicly told to move out, that I wished my parents stability and would not be discussing this further, and that any future stories about me taking advantage were false and would be met with the same calm documentation attached here. And then I put my phone face down and looked at my brother, who was now very invested in his shoelaces, and told him that if he forwarded one more lie about me, I would forward his application screenshot to the aunt who co-signed his last bailout, which made him choke on a word he did not get to finish. The room changed then, not into a hug circle, that was never going to happen, but into something more honest, because without the fog of rumor there was just the math and the pride and the choices, and my dad finally asked the only question that mattered. Which was what now? And I said, now you call the bank and make your own arrangement or you sell. And he said, we cannot sell. And I said, then pay. And he said, with what? And I said, with the same ingenuity you expect from me when I solve things. You do not want to touch. And he said, this is cruelty. And I said, this is an end to unpaid labor. And my mom whispered that she was scared. And I said, I know, and being scared is not the same as being entitled to my spine. I could have ended there and some people would have been satisfied, but I have learned that half measures invite revisionist history, so I reached into the folder's inner pocket and took out the slim envelope I had added last night, the one with the copy of the deed page that too many people assume they understand, and I did not wave it around or make a speech. I just tapped it against the table and said we are meeting with a neutral third party tomorrow to review the structure we set up years ago, and I gave them the name of the title officer and the time, and I said bring any papers you think contradict this, because I am done being the only person at the table who knows what is actually signed. And I could see in my dad's eyes the flicker that says he had not even realized there were versions of the story he had never seen. As I stood to leave, because I was not going to linger long enough for guilt to find new angles, I added the small, precise move that turned this from defense into pressure, which was to tell my dad that until the meeting, I had placed a temporary freeze on any automatic withdrawals from any accounts where my name appears as a responsible party, including the utility autopays I set up when everything was chaos, and that any reconnection would require my explicit authorization in writing, which I would not be giving, and then I put my hand on the envelope, looked at both of them, and said that tomorrow would be either a plan or a reckoning, their choice, and I walked out before anyone could turn the moment into a plea, leaving them with the quiet sound of their own house and a clock that had finally started ticking for them instead of me, because the final move was already lined up and waiting for morning. The title officer's conference room was not a courtroom and there was no audience, which suited me, because I did not need a show, I needed a record. So when the woman across the table opened the folder I had asked her to prepare and slid the vesting deed to the center, I did not look at my dad to see whether he was ready. I looked at the line that has steadied me for years, the part that names the owner. And I read it out loud in the same calm voice I use when I decide that I am done translating for people who refuse to learn, because there it was in plain words without drama, the property held by my revocable trust with me as trustee, established during the refinance when the lender needed stability and the title company needed clarity, a structure no one cared about understanding at the time because the important thing then was that the house stopped wobbling, and yes, the loan was joint and the monthly payment notices came with my parents' names on them because that made the lender's boxes line up, but the title never moved the way my dad tells it at holidays. The title sat exactly where I put it when everything was burning, which was under my legal control with a simple clause about who could occupy the place. And when the officer pointed to the signature page from that year and said this is what you signed, my dad went quiet in a way I have rarely seen, because silence is heavy when it carries your own handwriting. He tried a last stand that anyone raised on pride would try. He said no one explained it like that, and he thought the trust was just paperwork to help me qualify, and the officer, who has no interest in family politics and only cares about what is on the page, said that the vesting deed is exactly what it says it is, and that it was explained in the standard way at the time, and she even noted the initials by each paragraph, and my mom, who had been spiraling all morning between fear and denial, asked in a very small voice whether that meant I could sell the house without their permission, and the answer, given gently but without wiggle room, was that as trustee with full powers I could list and sell. subject to paying off the loan and complying with the occupancy clause we all signed, which required reasonable notice and nothing more, and I could feel the room tilt, not because I was gloating, but because the air finally contained the truth. And in that moment, I understood that the final move was not an act of vengeance, it was a correction I should have made long ago. I did not stand up and declare anything because dramatic speeches are bait, so I placed my own packet on the table and said I had brought a proposal that would keep everyone afloat without asking me to carry the weight anymore. And I spoke slowly because I wanted no one to pretend they misheard. I said I would be listing the house within the month with a reputable agent I had already interviewed, that the sale would pay off the mortgage and the costs, that I would reimburse myself for the documented advances and insurance and fees I had covered across the years pursuant to the indemnity agreement they both signed at the original closing, which the officer had included in the folder and which contained a sentence in plain language about me being made whole for any payments I made on their behalf, and that the remainder, if any, would go into a small account for my mom to manage without strings from anyone, because I am not trying to punish her for the way she avoids details. I am trying to protect her from the way details have been weaponized in our house. My dad said over my dead body in that flat tone he uses when he is cornered, and I said there was no need for that kind of talk because this was not a threat, it was a plan. And then I added the condition that would decide whether this ended as a small war or a ceasefire, which was that in exchange for 60 days of rent-free occupancy while I prepped the house for market, they would sign a brief statement I had already drafted that corrected the rumors, acknowledged that I had supported the mortgage and insurance for years, and asked the family to refrain from further commentary, and they would agree in writing to a mutual non-disparagement clause that included my brother, who would also sign, with the understanding that any breach would cancel the 60-day grace and convert it to 30 days with rent at the market rate, and the title officer, to her credit, simply nodded and said that was a private agreement and perfectly acceptable to attach to the file for clarity on timelines. Which is exactly why I brought her into the room, because facts behave better when someone neutral is present. There was a moment then when my mom looked at me not as the child she worries over, but as the adult who has been standing behind the curtain for years, and she asked if I was doing this to get even, and I told her the truth I could not say when I was younger, that I am doing this to get out of the role that made me helpful and invisible, out of the stories that made me small so other people could feel big, out of the cycle where I fixed things to keep the peace and then held my breath, waiting for someone to notice, and that if getting out looked like getting even to the people who preferred the old arrangement, I could live with that, because I had lived with worse. My brother muttered that this was extortion wrapped in manners, and I said it was accountability dressed in paperwork, which is the only language that seems to work here, and he went quiet when I slid a second sheet his way. A short and precise repayment schedule for the advances I had made on his behalf that he promised to cover and never did, with a discount if he paid in full by the end of the year, and a note that any false statement about me to any relative or church friend would void the discount immediately, and he laughed in that brittle way he uses when he wants to look like nothing lands, but he signed because he recognized the handwriting of consequences. My dad did not sign right away because men like him need to pretend they still have leverage even when the board is already tilting, so he asked what would happen if he refused, and I told him exactly what would happen. I would post the statutory notice required by the occupancy clause. I would change the locks on the listing date with a sheriff present if needed, and I would deliver the correction to the extended family myself with copies of the documents attached. Because I am done letting the loudest person own the version of me that travels, and there was nothing cruel in my tone and no heat, just the kind of finality people respect when they realize it is not a bluff, and after a long minute that aged all of us, he took the pen and signed. And he did not look at me while he did it, which was probably the most honest part. I left the title office without hugging anyone because closure is not a group activity, and over the next weeks I did exactly what I said I would do. I hired the agent, scheduled the inspections, coordinated the small fixes that make a listing move, And I kept my distance from the house beyond the necessary walkthroughs, because the boundary was part of the remedy, and when the correction went out to the family thread, my phone lit up with messages that ranged from mea culpas to silence, which is fine. Silence is a kind of respect when gossip has been your soundtrack for too long, and when the first open house date was set, I sent it to my parents with the same neutral tone I had used all along. And I included a note reminding them of the move-out date we agreed on, and I meant it when I wished them a soft landing, even if the landing did not include me. On the last night before the listing went live, my dad sent a text that said "you win," and I looked at it for a long minute, because the old part of me wanted to reply with comfort, to smooth the spike, to make it easier for him to swallow the pill he poured for me at my own birthday. And then the part of me that has learned how to leave well picked up the phone and typed the line that finally matched the truth of the last years. Not a victory lap, not a threat. Just the plain sentence I had been walking toward this whole time. I did not win. I stopped losing, and then I turned the phone face down and slept without the weight I had mistaken for love. And in the morning I handed the keys to the agent and walked away from the house. I kept standing while being told I was a guest, not with triumph or bitterness, just with the steadiness that comes when the final move has already landed, clean and irreversible. And the story that hunted me finally runs out of road.